I'm recording. Okay, so our speaker this afternoon, Professor David Shivitz, is a local, relative local to us here in Chicago. And so again, even in the Zoom era, however, where I guess a scholar can speak from anywhere, it's really special to have someone from our region, someone who I've had the pleasure of learning from and learning with numerous occasions before, and who spoke physically at our shul just last year on Tisha B'Av, and I hope physically we'll have you back in our shul as we can all be physically in each other's shuls and in person at some point in the future. I am going to post his full bio in the chat box, so you can read about him there. Just say that he's Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Northwestern University here, just up the road a bit in Evanston, and the director of Northwestern University's Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies, and he's the author of important scholarship books and articles, and the rest of his bio you can read in the chat again, so you don't have to, you don't have to hear me read it. Okay, you can read it yourself. Okay, so without further ado, really my honor to turn things over to Professor Shivitz.
All right, Wolkenfeld, thank you so much. I'm going to ask if it's possible to enable screen sharing. I just have some sources that I'm hoping to show. And I'll also ask you actually for a reminder of our time frame. Do we have, how long are we looking at for this year?
Rabbi, you're muted.
Oh.
You have up to an hour, okay?
Okay,
you don't have to take all that time. You have up to an hour.
No problem, no problem. Okay, great. Wanted to just double check. You don't want to, start giving a 2-hour shiur and then realize halfway through that you're done. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides. I hope that everyone is healthy and having a meaningful fast. And there we go. And it's really a great pleasure to join Anshe Shalom once again, and to have an opportunity to be part of the Zoom era, where we can share scholarship across the country and really across the world. So I think it's one of the silver linings of the period we all find ourselves in now. Let me start with a caveat or two. In general, those of you who have had the chance to study with in person, so you may know that I much prefer to keep things interactive and to have sort of robust Q&A and comments and discussion. Zoom is not a great medium for that. So I think what we'll start off doing, if it's okay with all of you, is keeping ourselves muted, just to make sure that there isn't a lot of feedback or sort of noise in the background. And then I'll ask everyone to enter questions, comments into the chat box, and I'll try to pause periodically to just check and sort of take the temperature of the room. But I am hoping to leave time at the end for live Q&A, where we can actually engage with one another as a community. And I'm not sure if this is actually possible. I may ask you all to fill out a poll if we have time for it, but that may be as interactive as things get. Okay, so really what I'm hoping substantively for us to cover today is just an interesting sort of thought experiment, and I'm hoping that we'll think it through together, and I'm hoping to present just a little bit of historical material that will help us think through what I believe is a really pressing public policy issue that we face in America and really across the world today. And to set the stage or frame the conversation, I'll share just a personal anecdote. A few weeks ago, I received an email from someone who I know a little bit, a friend of a friend, who is a Jewish communal professional, who asked whether I had been following local news in St. Louis, Missouri. I try to stay abreast of Israeli news and American news, and sort of, current events, but I am not good on specifically the St. Louis media market. And so I told her that I had not been staying up to date on whatever the issue was. And she clued me in. She shared some news media, some recordings, video of a controversy that over the past, I'd say, month or so has developed around this statue. Any of you who've been to St. Louis before might recognize it. The statue is called, here's another view. It's called the Apotheosis of St. Louis, Saint Louis. And it has, since 1906, so for 115 years or so, stood in this spot in the cultural center of the St. Louis area. This is in front of the Art Museum in Forest Park. Again, any of you who've been there, it's a lovely place to visit. And the statue commemorates the city's namesake, Saint Louis, who reigned as King of France from 1226 to 1270, and who was known during his lifetime and afterwards for his piety, for his charity, for his devotion. Saint Louis is the only king of France to ever have been canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, and he's still venerated, widely venerated today. Now, the statue came on the radar screen of some local activists in the past month due to a petition. Well, here, you know what, I'll show some media first. So the statue is not obviously controversial, and yet it, as you can see from the news report here, served as a sort of a meeting ground between two competing groups of protesters. One group of whom was trying to, I think, show their disdain for the statue by painting it, right? By sort of trying to cover up the imagery that it encapsulates. And the other group of which was doing as best it can to protect the statue and prevent it from being what they would say defaced. Here's one image. Again, these are just pulled from some of the news coverage over the last couple of weeks. Here we can see people at least wearing masks, but really getting up in each other's faces and vehemently disagreeing, one would think, about the statue. Here the masks have gone, they're still up in each other's faces, but you can get a sense of at least some of the religious stakes that this statue might have from the fact that we have here a Catholic priest who is part of the melee, right? Who's part of the fray. And you can get a sense of what is at stake here and why this statue in this moment in time has come to be a flashpoint. From the petition that was circulated, the petition's title was "Change the Name of St. Louis," that is, change the name of the city of St. Louis, on the petition on the website change.org. So here's some selections from that petition. For those unfamiliar with King Louis IX, he was a rabid anti-Semite who spearheaded many persecutions against the Jewish people. Centuries later, Nazi Germany gained inspiration and ideas from Louis IX as they embarked on a campaign of murderous genocide against the Jewish people. Louis IX was also vehemently Islamophobic and led a murderous crusade against Muslims, which ultimately cost him his life. St. Louis, the city now, has a large and vibrant Jewish and Muslim community, and it's an outright disrespect for those who are part of these faith communities to have to live in a city named after a man committed to the murder of their co-religionists. I ask all people of good faith, committed to the modern values of equity and coexistence, to sign this petition to rename the city of St. Louis to something more suitable and indicative of our values. Now, this is the sort of clearest articulation of the motivation that has sort of been behind much of this sort of tumult around the statue, the attempts to sort of cover it up, the attempts to advocate not only for the removal of the statue from this very public place, but also for the removal of the name of St. Louis himself from the city in favor of some other apparently more suitable or more value-laden name. What's the response been? Well, as you might imagine, the response from believing Catholics for whom St. Louis is a saint has not been terribly positive. So this is from an article that was published in the Jewish Telegraphic Association. Should St. Louis take down the statue of its anti-Semitic namesake? And I just found this quote to be a really remarkable articulation of a different view than the one that we saw in the petition. Every night, a group of several dozen Catholics gather by the statue to recite the rosary. This is still true today. One of them, who shall go by these initials, called the statue a remarkable work of art. She emphasized that she reveres Louis IX as a man who really wanted to follow God and who wanted to do the right thing. She feels his persecution of the Jews should be viewed in historical context. He wanted people to be Catholic because the Catholic Church believed that when you're Catholic, that's the way to fully serve God, she said. He believed that with his whole heart and soul, and he wanted that for the Jewish people. Do we think that the way he went about that is wrong now? Sure. I mean, everybody has a right to their opinion on that. But at the time, we can't be so sure because we have to be careful and look at the context of his actions. Now, there's an initial difficulty, a logistical difficulty, with the idea that St. Louis should be taken down and the city should be renamed. And that is the fact that St. Louis is actually everywhere. Once you start to look for him in America and certainly in Europe and certainly in France, it's hard to escape his sort of ever-present, omnipresent shadow. So there's a statue of St. Louis not only in St. Louis, but on the walls of the US House of Representatives, in the Supreme Court. And this, again, ties into that reputation that has accrued to him for justness, for piety, for sort of combining devotion with effective political rule. Once you start looking for St. Louis's, or Saint Louis' view of Jews, however, so as the petition indicated, you get a very different image. And I'll give you just one example to start with, and this is from the hagiography, the biography written by one of his admirers of St. Louis, by Jean de Jonville, who recounts a story that took place when the king was a young boy, and when he witnessed a disputation between a Christian cleric and a Jew. The two of them, this was set in Cluny, which is an important monastic center in medieval France. The two of them were debating. They were sort of rehashing the differences between Judaism and Christianity, trying to convince one another of the truth of their respective positions. And a knight who was observing got so fed up with the back and forth and the arguing that he basically took his sword, walked into the middle of the debating stage, and smote the Jewish debater, and said to the young King St. Louis, this is the way you should be handling these kinds of issues, not with back and forth, not with rhetoric, not with discussion, but with violence. And later in life, the king would say to his biographer, I agree myself that no one who's not a very learned cleric should argue with the Jews. A layman, as soon as he hears the Christian faith maligned, should defend it only by the sword, with a good thrust in the Jew's belly, as far as the sword will go. So, if I were to ask all of you, the 46 or so of us who are on the call, given what little we've learned about St. Louis so far and what else you might know, and we'll have more to say about him in a moment, where would you be leaning on the issue of removing his statue, on the issue of renaming the city? I think it's going to be hard to set up a poll now. I probably should have. I can do it. Okay. There's going to be a poll, hopefully going out over Zoom, with a yes or a no. If you're in favor of getting rid of the statue and renaming the city, click yes. If you're opposed, click no. And let's see if we can get any kind of data from this group. Oh, amazing. I've been teaching on Zoom for months now, and I've never used a poll so far, but this is really fun. So I'm not sure who can follow in real time, but I can tell you that of our votes so far, it's about 2/3 against renaming the city, and now over a third in favor. I'm going to let this poll run in the background, and we can revisit it a little while from now. And I guess the question I'd ask you to think about is, right, what kind of historical context would be necessary for you to make that decision and feel comfortable with it, right? Our Catholic interlocutor said the persecution of the Jews needs to be viewed in historical context. And I guess the question that I'm curious to have us think about is, what is that context? And ultimately, what does historical context do for us in making these kinds of decisions, in thinking about how we commemorate the past and relate it to the present? Now, in addition to this line from Louis' biography, which I would guess most of us have not encountered before. So there's, we'll come back to that in a second. There's a much better known connection between St. Louis and Tisha B'Av, and that, of course, is the trial of the Talmud, from which the title of this talk is taking its name. This refers to a series of disputations in the year 1240, and then with some after effects in subsequent years, in which St. Louis basically presided, together with the royal family, together with the Bishop of Paris, who would have been based here in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, together with many of the learned Christian intellectuals of medieval Paris, who would have been based here at the University of Paris, which was a theological school. So all of these groups together presided over a disputation between Christians and Jews over the role of the Talmud and over whether it sort of should be tolerated within a Christian society. And any of you who were in synagogue this morning probably recited the most famous historical artifact of that, or Jewish liturgical artifact of that period, Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh, the Kina, the dirge that was written by the Maharami Rothenburg, or the mayor of Rothenburg, who was a student in Paris and observed some of these events firsthand. Now, if you only know Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh, so I think we don't yet have enough of that historical context that we were talking about to fully flesh out this issue. And so what I'm hoping to do in the next little while is to take us a few years prior to the authorship of that Kina, look at some of the historical data that went into the formulation of Christian doctrines about the Talmud, and especially the burning of the Talmud that culminated at the end of this trial. And then to use that as a way of thinking through some of these issues, which are so sort of pressing for us today, not just today in 2020, as we think about the Confederacy and other sort of limits of acceptable public discourse in our own world, but that are also so relevant today, meaning on Tisha B'Av. Because one of the key questions that we think about every Tisha B'Av is exactly that. How do we commemorate and memorialize the past? Which parts of the Jewish past do we need to revisit on an annual basis? And maybe which parts can be safely forgotten? So we're going to give some historical background and then look at some text together, but it's going to be in the service of trying to give ourselves the framework with which we can answer that question that I posed at the beginning. How do we relate to all of these events of the 13th century here in the 21st century? So in terms of historical background, the trial of the Talmud was apparently initiated at the behest of a Jewish convert to Christianity named Nicholas Donin, and I'm mindful of the fact that some of this historical background may be new to some of you. Some of it is likely not new to others of you, so I'm going to try to go through it relatively quickly, but also comprehensively enough. When Nicholas Donin, in the mid-13th century, tried to convince both the rulers of Europe and especially the papacy that the Talmud, the Jewish Talmud, was a problematic text, that it needed to be eliminated, that it could no longer be tolerated in Christendom. He was not the first, but he may have been one of the most successful Christian thinkers to try to advance this argument. So already more than 100 years earlier, there had been Jews who converted to Christianity and some Christians who employed Jewish converts to put together translations of the Talmud, translations of Talmudic passages, in an effort to sort of understand what Jews were motivated by and to have a better sense of what Jews were doing in their religious life, and ultimately how Jews might be convinced that they should not remain Jews, but that they should become Christians. Nicholas Donin is the most successful of these Jewish converts because he manages to get the ear of Pope Gregory IX, who really took to this mission, and who wrote a series of letters to many of the major kings of Europe, not only Saint Louis in France, but also the kings of Spain and of Portugal and of England and other rulers in Western Europe. Of those rulers, really only Saint Louis took up the call and sort of ran with it, to the extent that in 1240, as we said, in partnership with the church and with the university theologians, they convened this gathering. The representative of the Jews was there were four representatives, but the main one was somebody named Rabbi Yechiel Mipari, a very important Jewish intellectual, one of the Baalei Tosafot, the head of the yeshiva of the Jews of Paris, somebody with many students and with a lot of influence. And he personally was opposed by Nicholas Donin. So the two of them spent their time debating some of the key issues in the Talmud and some of the key issues in Jewish-Christian relations. We know about this series of events from a number of different documents. There were some Latin transcripts and Latin summaries of the proceedings that were preserved from the Christian side, and a number of Jewish transcripts preserved in Hebrew from the Jewish side. Now, ultimately, the question that Louis faced was the one we alluded to before, which is sort of, what's the line separating offensive beliefs from unspeakable ones? what extent can Jews be allowed, tolerated in their error? Or are there certain errors that Jews make and certain beliefs that they hold to that are so erroneous and so offensive and maybe so blasphemous that we can't even tolerate their mistakenness, right? So at what point does tolerating Jewish error in fact make Christians culpable for that error? Now, in the trial of the Talmud, that plays out in three different domains. The first of them has to do with attacks against Jesus and Mary and Christians that Nicholas Donin argues are part and parcel of Talmudic Judaism. So he finds a number of passages, some of them taken out of context, some of them not really taken out of context, that say really offensive things about Jesus and Mary and about arguably about Christianity. One of the best known examples of these comes from Masechet Gittin, where there's a discussion of the suffering in the afterlife of a number of sort of famous sinners. One of them is Jesus, and the opinion in the Talmud that's quoted says that Jesus is suffering in the afterlife for an eternity in a vat of boiling excrement. Pretty bad way to go if you had to choose. But Jesus gets the worst of these punishments, as it's described in Masechet Gittin, precisely because he's understood in that passage and in some other passages too to be really an arch nemesis and a very problematic figure who's understood to be a threat. Oh, okay, there we go. So for those, I meant to show this image earlier, but for those who needed an image break, I'm sure many of you who've been to Paris recognize the Hôtel de Ville. This is the city hall, the 19th century building of the city hall in Paris, and the sort of right underneath where this ice skating rink is now is the public execution grounds in 13th century France, and that's where the Talmud was burned at the culmination of this proceedings in 1241 or 1242. So that first line of argument having to do with blasphemy against Jesus, blasphemy against Mary, blasphemy against Christianity. So it's not terribly uncommon. And in a certain way, it's the least surprising part of the trial of the Talmud. Because there had been attacks on the Talmud and on Jews earlier, and there would be many attacks on the Talmud and on Jews later in precisely this vein, right? The argument being that the Jews are saying really mean and offensive stuff, and we don't want to have to hear it. So an example of the afterlife of this, right? Subsequent sort of repercussions of this line of argumentation might be the burning of the Talmud 300 or so years later in 1553 in Rome. This is the Campo de Fiore on the right, where the Talmud was burned in the mid-16th century, and here's a sort of a commemorative plaque on the left, where you can see a description in Hebrew and in Italian, including a citation here, Sha'alisu faba esh l'shloma ve'laich, a sort of gesture to the earlier burning of the Talmud, very moving in its way. But as time went on, into early modernity and into modernity, again, the sort of obvious move, which is to comb through the Talmud and find things that either are or could be misconstrued as immoral and offensive and blasphemous, this is something that influences many subsequent critics of Judaism. So, for example, Judaism Unveiled, this is a 1700 edition of a German text translating passages from the Talmud, totally decontextualized, in an effort to try to show that the contents of this sort of secret Jewish knowledge are problematic and in need of elimination. Or from a little bit later, the Talmud Jude of Professor Rohling, a German scholar, a German Hebraist, who actually not only published on the secret immoral contents of the Talmud, but even served as an expert witness in at least one blood libel persecution. He was called for the prosecution to testify that Jews say in the Talmud that they need Christian blood, they like to drink Christian blood. So this is somebody who, again, was not just a thinker, but a doer. We could say the same of his slightly later contemporary, a Russian author who wrote, again, about the view of Christians in Talmudic Judaism. He too served as an expert witness. Actually, this book was famously debunked because when the author was called as an expert witness in the Bayless trial, a famous blood libel accusation in Russia, it emerged under cross-examination that he actually didn't know any Hebrew. He didn't know any Talmud. He couldn't even name the names of the Masechtot of the Talmud. So sort of an interesting aside, but part and parcel of a tradition, again, of looking within the Talmud for this kind of offensive material. We can find it in America too, sadly. One of the main articles in this edition of Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent from the early 20th century had to do with a study of the Talmud and an effort to show that according to the Talmud, Kol Nidre is in fact a Jewish license for dishonesty. Jews are always winning in business because they're always cheating in business, and that's because the Talmud tells them how. It gives them the language they need to not hold by any of the oaths that they take when they're conducting business. And last but not least, I don't want to focus on this, but it's just sort of, maybe worth closing the circle. Just in the last year, there was a pretty significant amount of public debate over Alice Walker's poem, It's Our Frightful Duty to Study the Talmud. If you haven't come across this is a small selection from a longer poem, but I put in bold some of the choice quotes, where she says, if you want to know something about the Talmud, the best place to start is YouTube. Simply follow the trail of the Talmud as its poison belatedly winds its way into our collective consciousness. It sort of goes on and gets worse from there. So this is not something that we are free of even today. And again, it's building on 800-900 years worth of tradition of these decontextualized, or at least minority positions within a very vast and complicated corpus in an effort to show these negative views that Jews have of non-Jews. The second direction that Nicholas Donin goes in the trial of the Talmud is one that to me is a little bit more interesting. Or maybe I should say more interesting for our purposes today. And that is that he evaluates the teachings, the theological teachings of the Talmud on their own merits and concludes that they are inane or illogical. And he basically finds passages, well, for example, like the following. This is a selection from a Latin document which outlines 30-something findings about the Talmud that Nicholas Donin presumably put together. And if we can say one thing about this former Jew, Nicholas Donin, it's that he was a real Baki B'Shas. He knew his stuff. And he selects thematic sort of headings that he then populates with all the texts that confirm it. So here's one of his examples of inane teachings from the Talmud. And I'm mindful of the fact that we're limited in terms of what Torah we should and shouldn't be learning on Tisha B'Av. So I've tried to choose selections that all have to do with the destruction of the temple, just to keep us in a proper mindset. So in Masechet Brachot, we read that every night, sorry, I'm having trouble seeing this. There we go. God curses himself because he destroyed the temple and sent the Israelites into slavery. So there it says, there are 3 watches in the night, and before one watch and another, God sits and cries out like a lion and says, woe is me, because I destroyed my home, and I burned my palace, and I sent my children into captivity among the nations of the world. Rabbi Yossi said, I once entered a ruined part of the wall of Jerusalem to pray, and Elijah of good memory came and guarded the door for me and waited until I finished my prayer. So now we have a story that follows, in which basically this Rabbi Yossi, has gone into a ruined building to pray. And when he comes out, he has a conversation with the prophet Elijah, who says to him, what did you hear in there? And Rabbi Yossi says, I said to him, the daughter of a voice, a bat kol, right, a heavenly voice, cooing like a dove, and saying, woe is me, because I made my home a wasteland, and I burned my palace, and I sent my children into captivity among the nations of the world. And Elijah said to me, by your life and the life of your body, not only at this hour does he speak thus, but every day he speaks in this way. That is, God is constantly bemoaning the sort of mistake he made, or the decision he had to take to exile the Jews and destroy the temple. That's not all, but at the time when the Israelites enter houses of prayer and schoolhouses and respond, let his name be blessed, God shakes his head and says, happy is the king who's praised in such a way in his own house. Woe to the father who has enslaved his own children, and woe to those children who've been sent into captivity away from their father's table. Now, in context, this functions for Nicholas Donin as a sort of self-evident mockery or self-mockery within the Talmud of any kind of well-thought-out theology. The idea that God does things and then feels bad about it, The idea that God cries as though he's been forced to act in a certain way against his will. The idea that God is sort of making all of this known to a rabbi, and that he is sort of advertising to humanity his own errors in judgment or his regret for having acted in the way that he did. This is theologically sort of, mishmash, nonsense for Nicholas Donin, to the extent that he doesn't even give us too much of an explanation. He just quotes it, and it seems to stand on its own as a self-evident example of Talmudic inanity. Again, the idea being that the Talmud contains lots of these kinds of passages, especially in the Agadah, that are on their face theologically absurd. How could a perfect God make decisions that he then feels he has to cry about? How can God cry whatsoever? A second, or I should say a third direction, really, right? Because we've said the first was finding passages in the Talmud that are offensive to Jesus and Mary and so on. The second was this sort of passages that are inane and illogical and theologically problematic. And the third line of direction that Nicholas Donin adopts in the trial of the Talmud is aimed at the very thrust of Jewish legal theory itself, which is to say the idea that the oral Torah accompanies the written Torah, and that the Torah shebichtav can only be understood in light of the Torah sheba'al peh. Nicholas Donin and all of the Christian interlocutors who are participating in the trial of the Talmud find this to be absolutely insane and off limits. What could it possibly mean that the rabbis, as guardians of the tradition of Torah sheba'al peh, have carte blanche, have the authority to tell Jews what the written Torah does and doesn't say, it does and doesn't mean? This gives the rabbis the ability to basically, according to Nicholas Donin, make up whatever they want and impose any kind of religious ideology or religious practice on Jews, regardless of whether it fits with the written Torah or not. The most famous example of this, of course, is one that I didn't bring here. It's the story of the Tanur Shalachnai. Again, a story that maybe is not familiar to all of us, but I'm sure is familiar to some of us. It's essentially the archetype for a story about a rabbinic debate in which the minority position is clearly right from a divine theological perspective, but the majority position of rabbis wins out nonetheless. And the law is decided in accordance with the majority of the rabbis, even though the minority has God among it. The famous line at the end of this story is Nitzchuni Banai, where God basically concedes that he has been defeated, and his view about what the halacha ought to be is obviously not going to win out because he's been overruled. Now, there's a very, very long tradition of Jewish interpretation of that story. But Christian interpretations, for example, in Nicholas Donin's writings, are, again, that it's self-evidently absurd on its face. For the rabbis to claim this prerogative shows only that they are grasping for power, despite the obvious sort of illogical nature of them siding against God and ultimately winning out. Another example, another text that gives an example of this line of thinking, again, having to do with the destruction of the temple, is from the Babylonian Talmud. Rabbi Chia bar Ami said in the name of Ula, since the day the temple was destroyed, the Holy One, blessed be he, has in his world only the 4 cubits of halacha alone. And in context in the Talmud, this is an indication that God today is found less in prayer and less in communion with him than in the study of Torah sheba'al peh. The rabbis, as the arbiters of halacha, are ultimately the gatekeepers to God because God is squished into these 4 cubits of halacha and they're alone. Now, this passage, both of these passages, again, both of them having to do with sort of the destruction of the temple as a breaking point, a rupture in history where God begins to regret his actions and where God is confined to the world of halacha, to the Torah sheba'al peh. These come up in the disputation, and Nicholas Donin really focuses in on them with quite a bit of disdain. Rabbi Yechiel of Paris responds, right, as speaking for sort of the defense, in a really interesting way. So his first line of defense is as follows. He says, the first of your words, or mocking and joking about scripture, that God only has the 4 cubits of Torah. That's the second passage that we just saw. Are you not aware, and have you not heard, that when the temple was in existence, his presence dwelt there and was concentrated between the kruvim, the cherubim. And therefore the temple became beloved to him. In other words, Rabbi Yechiel is trying to take what Nicholas Donin thinks is an illogical argument and explain it in rational terms that will be comprehensible to Christianity. God used to be based in the temple. Now that the temple is laid waste and desolate, now God is in heaven. Right? So God is in fact more ethereal, more abstract than he was before, which is what the text means when it says that God takes delight only in the 4 cubits that a man occupies when he occupies himself with Torah. For in the entire world, no one calls out his name and does his will other than the man who occupies himself with Torah and worships him there. And 4 cubits is the measure of space that the man occupies. What has he done? He's taken what seems to be a limitation of God. The rabbis are the arbiters of God, and they have more power over God than is appropriate. And he's turned it around to say that God is in fact in heaven, totally transcendent. And it's human beings engaging with Torah, right, that serves as the ultimate mode of worship of God. It's directed not at a power play on the part of the rabbis, but as a means, a conduit towards communion with God. And that 4 cubits is not meant to delimit God, but only to sort of map out the measure of space that man occupies. He tries to do a similar thing with regard to that second passage that we noted, where he says, 3 times a day, the Holy One, blessed be he, weeps. So he says, have you not exaggerated much more greatly about your God? Who's to say that one religion is more rational and the other is more irrational? You've told tales larger and more miraculous than these about your God. Read the New Testament and you'll find no shortage of miraculous stories that seem every bit as irrational and illogical as the ones that you are calling attention to. And in fact, when our rabbis tell their irrational story, what they're really doing is just riffing on a biblical verse. Right? Because scripture says the Lord will roar from on high, from his holy habitation, utter his voice, he'll roar mightily over his abode. When the rabbis say that God is feeling regretful, you can't take it literally as meaning that God is sitting there screaming. It's the rabbis using biblical interpretation to take a text about God and apply it to their present circumstances. And I want to say more on that in just a second. Before I do, though, let me pause for a second. We're about halfway done. And see if there are any questions waiting for us in the chat. There's one, it's not a question, there's one comment, and it goes back to the story about Jesus in Masechet Gittin. Jesus does boil in, according to the Talmud, according to that view in the Talmud, in boiling excrement. There's another sinner, Bilam, who's boiling in Shichvat Zera Rotacha, in boiling semen. So I guess I said before that Jesus had the worst possible option. I'll leave it up to you to decide which of these horrible options is the most horrible option. If I may have misspoken. Okay, if there are more questions, please don't hesitate to stick them in or other comments. Now, this last piece, where Yechiel of Pari responds to Nicholas Donin saying, your question indicates that you just don't get what Talmud is about. That there's something going on in these Aggadic stories, whether it's biblical interpretation, right, or something else, which is not about its literal meaning, but about some message that can be extracted from it. So I think this is a key ingredient, not only in his rhetorical strategy, but actually in the attitude of Jews and Christians to the Talmud in this period in general. And I want to give you one other source that will hopefully help us make sense of this. This needs a little bit of contextualization. When Nicholas Donin identifies passages that call attention to Jesus or to his students and seem to malign them, so he calls all of these out in the disputation and basically says to Rabbi Yechiel, look at all these terrible references to our God and to our sort of worshipers in your Talmud. And the response that Rabbi Yechiel of Paris generally gives is, no, that's not talking about Christians at all. It's talking about some other group, some other heretics. This is around the period where we start to see a distinction between referring to Notzrim and referring to Akum, Ovdei Kochavim Umazalot, which is a more capacious term that maybe only applies to real pagans and not Christians. That's the general strategy that Rabbi Yechiel adopts. Except that in this case, as I said before, Nicholas Donin knows his stuff. And he says, well, I've actually been going over the manuscripts, and Rashi, your greatest rabbi, explained that in this particular case, these were the students of Jesus the Nazarene. That is, the heretics and traitors and apostates that I've mentioned, in at least one case, no less than Rashi himself says explicitly that this is Jesus. You can't explain this away. Obviously, there's something really wrong here. And this, I think, is my favorite part of the whole text, because Rabbi Yechiel says to him, you think that everything Rashi explained is fixed and established? Didn't you know that Rabbeinu Tam and the Ri of Isaac of Dampierre, these are the most important Balei HaTosafot, actually relatives of Rashi. And the most brilliant rabbis criticized him often and refuted his opinions in many places. I'm imagining somebody sitting in front of Louis IX and Blanche of Castile, his mother, and the representative of the Pope, and basically saying, do you hold like Rashi or Rabbeinu Tam? What's your preference? In other words, what he's saying to him is, you are trying to extract from the Talmud a unified meaning, a univocal reading, when in fact the essence of the Talmud is its multivocality, is the inability to distill it down into one single view or opinion or consensus. For every Rashi, we have a Rabbeinu Tam or a Ri or any other brilliant rabbi who will criticize and refute his opinions. And that emphasis on criticism and refutation, the idea of machloket, of argument, that's contained here and that's being used as almost a get-out-of-jail-free card, right? Anytime you find something offensive, I could just say it's a machloket, right? There's different views, but it's true because there in fact are different views. So it tells us something really interesting about the historical setting during which this disputation is taking place. Let's take one example that will seem disconnected, but I hope can be pulled back in. One of the fascinating developments that we see in high medieval 12th and 13th century, specifically French Jewish culture, is a newfound emphasis on reading the text of the Torah Shebichtav for its own sake. This is called pshat. And again, I recognize that some of this is going to be maybe new to some of you and definitely old to some of you. What does pshat mean? So this essentially is reading the text of the Bible for its contextual meaning. Sometimes people throw around words like the literal meaning, the meaning that is conveyed in the verses themselves, rather than only using the Bible as sort of a jumping off point for rabbinic exegesis. We can all think of lots of examples of rabbinic exegesis that takes the words of the Bible and really runs with it in a very non-literal direction. Starting with Rashi, who we saw a moment ago, but really being picked up by his grandchildren and by later members of this school of pshat biblical interpreters, we find people who are more and more fixated and focused on Torah Shebichtav in and of itself. A great example of this, a famous example, is from Rashbam, Rav Shmuel ben Meir, the grandson of Rashi, who takes a verse that probably many of us know, Shatam la'ot al yadecha v'ayu t'tafot beininecha. This is the verse that the rabbis understand as a reference to tefillin, right? You should tie them on your arm and put them between your eyes on your head. Rashbam, uniquely for his time, or I should say maybe uncharacteristically for his time, explains that ot al yadecha does not mean tefillin in its literal sense. According to Omek Pshuto, the depth of the pshat, what this verse is telling us is that God's words should be a remembrance to you at all times, as though they were inscribed on your arm. And he brings a proof from Shir HaShirim to confirm it. What's the pshat of Ukshartam L'ot Al Yadecha? Always remember God's words as though they're tied to your arm. What's the drash? What's the rabbinic meaning? Wear tefillin. But you can get a sense already from this little passage of the vast disconnect that could develop theoretically between literal, right, or contextual or pshat interpretations of verses and then the rabbinic readings of those verses. It's almost driving a wedge between that unified idea that there is Torah Shebichtav and Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that one is incomprehensible without the other. So in a certain sense, the increased awareness on the part of Christians in this period that the Jews are not living by the Torah Shebichtav, but living by the Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that's problematic. So it echoes or it resonates to some degree with this wedge that actually is being driven between these two corpuses in this mode of biblical interpretation. I'll give you another example, another very famous example. One of the most programmatic statements of any biblical interpreter about the proper relationship between pshat and drash, between Torah shebichtav, right, the Hebrew Bible, and the Torah sheba'al peh, the Talmud, that has become such a bone of contention in this period. Says Rashbam, know and understand that when the Torah says no verse shall be taken out of its context, this is from the Talmud and Masechet Shabbat, the Torah is essentially teaching and informing us about laws and teachings and ordinances that are only hinted at through the pshat and which can be discerned through the analysis of language, right? In other words, we've got all of this material in Torah sheba'al peh, which you use hermeneutical principles to try and learn out, right? Gzera Shava and Kal Vachomer and all the other, right, famous tools that can be used to take the language of the Bible and apply it for drash, right, for Jewish law, for Jewish sort of exegesis. And he says that the earlier sages, the rabbis of the Talmud, dedicated themselves to discerning the teachings that are primary. They focused their attention on this drash mode, this interpretation, not of the contextual literal meaning, but of the legal meaning. And in doing so, they were not conversant with the plain meaning of the text. Rashbam says, but my grandfather Rashi, the same Rashi that Nicholas Donin is citing in the Talmud trial, enlightened the eyes of the exile by spending time on plain meaning of the text. And I, Shmuel ben Meir, his son-in-law, and here's the key word, disputed with him and before him. And he admitted to me that if he had the time, he would have needed to compose new explanations on account of the pshatim that are created anew each day. Now, pshatot, I should say. Hamitchadshim b'chol yom. Rashbam is saying here that there's something dramatically new happening in France in the High Middle Ages, something that no rabbis had previously done. He has a sort of a real self-awareness of the novelty of what it is that he and his cohort are trying to accomplish. And he specifies that the method by which this study takes place, so we can look in the Hebrew, those who want to follow along at the bottom, Af ani Shmuel b'Rabbi Meir, nitvakachti imo v'lefanav. We engaged in vikuchim, in disputations. The title for the disputation account of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris is Havikuach, Vikuach Rabbi Yechiel Paris. And that's because the disputation is not just, it is also, but it isn't just a sort of a forced encounter for polemical purposes between Jews and Christians. This is the way that you study text in the Middle Ages. Right? A vikuach, a disputation, is what Rashi convenes to hash out the text, the meaning of the text. It's also what the Balei Tosafot, the descendants of Rashi, who are the most important Talmudic commentators in the 12th and 13th centuries, it's what they engage in. The way that they study Talmud and try to reconcile all of the contradictions within it is also through a kind of a dialectical approach where there's sort of argument and dispute and an attempt to reconcile all of these conflicting opinions in a manner that echoes the vikuchim that Rashbam describes having with his grandfather Rashi. In fact, this was such a novel position that there were opponents of the Balei Tosafot who thought that disputation as a means towards study of text was problematic and should be off limits. So for instance, Sefer Hasidim, a text that was written not in France but in medieval Germany, goes out of its way to attack probably the Balei Tosafot or people engaging in their method of study, and saying that one should not teach any Torah that doesn't bring him to fear of heaven. This is what each person should engage in, but not the other wisdoms like Gentile dialectic. Don't spend your time studying in a dialectical way, which is a Gentile mode of study. Spend your time studying the real way, the Jewish way, in an attempt to cultivate fear of heaven for its sort of affective dimensions and its moral upshot. Only those wisdoms are truly Torah and the fear of God, not study involving disputation, as when two argue in order to defeat one another. Now, anyone who spent any time in a yeshiva probably knows that Sefer Hasidim has completely lost this battle hundreds of years ago, because if you watch Chavrutot, if you watch people studying, by and large, this sort of argumentative demeanor right? The effort to arrive at the truth through a process of mutual refinement is very, very common and is part and parcel of, one of the major ways that Torah and the Talmud continue to be studied to this day. But if we take these texts and sort of package them together, so it's very notable that at the same time that Rashbam and the Balei Tosafot are using this dialectical method, this sort of disputation as a tool for the study of text to arrive at a clear pshat, or to reconcile conflicting Talmudic positions in an effort to come up with an underlying truth or an underlying halachic implication. They're doing so at a moment in time, historically, when disputation is becoming the key way that Christian theology is studied in places like the University of Paris that we saw an image of before. So the very method that Jews are using in this novel way to study their own tradition echoes the method that Christians are using to study their own tradition in the same time and place, right? Paris and its surrounding sort of French culture. And it's ultimately culminating in a sense that there's so much novelty, things are new, the Jews are not treating the Bible necessarily as they always have been. They're certainly not treating the Talmud as they always have been. And that a meeting ground can be held between Christians and Jews to hash this out in a disputation. A disputation very much like the ones that Christians would be convening in the University of Paris to discuss Christian theology, and that Jews might be engaging in as they studied the Talmud and as they studied the Bible. So if we were to take this back and sort of come back to the question with which we began, and then I want to stop for some questions and comments, I'd like for us to be thinking, or I guess the historical context to me indicates that we can't be thinking about the trial of the Talmud solely as a sort of act of persecution inflicted on unwilling Jews, although it is that too, right? The burning of the Talmud is a catastrophe for the Jews of France, and the sort of symbolic value of the trial of the Talmud can't be overstated. But the way that it's being convened is in a mutually, so to speak, a mutually agreed upon forum that reflects the way that Jews and Christians are studying, the way they are using, sort of refining their own ideas in disputations with one another. And it's picking up on developments within the Jewish tradition itself that are not imagined by Christians, but that in fact show that there is really something new afoot in the way that Jews are studying Bible and in the way that Jews are studying the Talmud. So what does that do for us in terms of our own relationship to St. Louis? He's still the same guy who argued that we should stab Jews through their stomach, right, rather than dispute with them. But if anything, that might tell us that the disputation in Paris is happening not only at his behest, but to some extent against his better judgment. Because if he had his way, he'd be stabbing people with swords rather than trying to rationally think through their arguments in this kind of collaborative, although obviously very deeply antagonistic manner. Beyond that, I'm still toying with the statue in St. Louis. I'll check on our poll now. I wonder if anybody else has. So we came out almost exactly even. 43% in favor of renaming the city of St. Louis, 58% opposed. I'm not going to ask the yes votes and the no votes to engage in a disputation now, right? That would be one way that we could go about it. But I would like, in the 5 or so minutes that we have left, for people who want to share their opinions, to ask questions, to clarify anything, or to try and think through the relationship between these events in the 13th century and the questions about commemoration, about public discourse, about Jewish-Christian relations that I think are very much still relevant today in the 21st century. So a day like Tisha B'Av, where we sort of live through the past and we see our own present moment through the lens of centuries worth of Jewish experience, I think today is an appropriate day to be grappling with these questions and hopefully to do so on the basis of some historical context that we may not have had access to before. So thank you all so much for your attention. I'm sorry for monologuing for such a long time, but I'm happy to pause now and let's see what's in the chat. Okay.
As far as renaming the statue, the city of St. Louis and tearing down the statue, I just think this country has enough problems to deal with right now with the pandemic and with the demonstrations and the riots about other things that we ought to put this on the back burner.
Okay. So one representative of the 58% giving voice to, I think, a very a very plausible rationale. If anybody else who wants to jump in should feel free to do so. In the meantime, I'm looking at some of the questions that have come in the chat. Please don't hesitate. So somebody asked a question here, which I'll just try to briefly address while people are thinking through their views of any of this. Somebody asked, why were Christians so concerned with legally refuting or condemning the Talmud? Why were they interested in employing those forms of argumentation instead of just blanket condemnation? This is a great question. And again, on one level, I think it ties into the fact that this is the way that you engage in intellectual analysis and activity in this period of time. Disputation is not just a punishment for Jews, right? It's a technology, so to speak. And it's used, right, by the people who are trying to think about what role ought there to be for the Jews' errors in Christian public discourse. That they're wrong is obvious. But how wrong are they, and how sort of problematic would it be for us to tolerate their error, rather than becoming sort of culpable? Somebody asked if the audio became, oh no, I apologize. Okay, I'm going to keep talking and try to reposition my computer, but if you can't hear me, then I really do apologize. I'll just say one other thing in response to Binyamin's question, which is that there were reasons that there needed to be sort of legal discussions of whether Jewish texts should be tolerated or not, and that has to do with the previous rationale for allowing Jews to be tolerated in Europe in general. Jews were allowed in Europe to practice Judaism, or allowed in Christendom really, to practice Judaism under certain limited circumstances. This is sometimes called the doctrine of witness, which goes back to St. Augustine, who laid out a sort of a theory for why Jews should be allowed to live their religious life even though they're mistaken. And to change that very influential theology is something that I think, the Pope and certainly the King wouldn't have undertaken necessarily carte blanche. It's part of a broader move, as I said, in the 12th and 13th centuries and beyond, to continue thinking about what role should there be for this religious minority, and what do we owe them, and what do they owe to us? Okay. The sound quality went bad a few minutes ago. I really apologize for anything that was missed. And if anybody has other questions, I'm happy to take them. But I think we're also just about out. Oh, here comes one last question. 1 minute to go. Is Jesuit casuistry, which seems very similar to Talmudic and Rishonim analyses of moral questions, seeking to find distinctions, etc., similar to the form of disputation you described? That is another example of a form of reasoning that parallels in Jewish and Christian thought. So this is a great question, right? Casuistry, referring in general to a method of taking a specific case and using it as sort of a launching point for developing legal principles, right? Rather than reverse. I think there are definitely parallels. The Jesuits obviously are quite a bit later. But what I would just say to sort of, again, contextualize some of this is that it's worth noting that the best example of quote-unquote Gentile dialectic is the Talmud itself. You read Havayot, the Abaye Rava, right, the Shakla and Taya of the Gemara, they're engaged in disputation. This is what the rabbis do. That's why we have all of that machloket in the first place. I want to disprove what you said. Kasha, no, I didn't answer, right? That back and forth is a method of disputing and trying to arrive at truth through argumentation. And so what's noteworthy historically is that method of Talmudic analysis really goes into abeyance in the early Middle Ages. We don't find people arguing about Talmud in the way that Abaye and Rava did in the Talmud, really until we get to the Balei HaTosafot. If you read the Rif, if you read other sort of influential halachic texts from that period, that's not what they're interested in doing. They're doing other stuff, right? They have a different mode of grappling with the Talmud. Even Rambam, right? Rambam engages with the Talmud extensively, but not in any way similar to what the Balei HaTosafot do, or to what, right? Rambam famously wanted to get rid of all machloket from the Talmud. He thought that it was extraneous. So whether we call it casuistry, or whether we call it shakla v'tarya, whether we call it dialectica shel goyim, there is something new or maybe renewed happening in the 12th and 13th centuries that seems to us very familiar because it's so much like the Talmud itself. But we need to look at it in a historical perspective to realize that it was a resurgence of something that really had not been sort of common up until that point. And in in some degree, I think we need to think about the broader Christian surroundings, again, in Paris and beyond, if we want to understand why that method of analysis came back into vogue. So again, I hope that all of this gives us some context in next year. Hopefully we will not be reciting keynotes. Hopefully we'll all be in Yerushalayim. But in the event that we ever find ourselves encountering Shalit Sufa Ba'esh again, I hope we'll know that that is the final statement of Maharam Rottenberg at the end of the trial of the Talmud, but that what he's responding to is a much richer and more complicated and in some ways more antagonistic but also collaborative set of discussions and encounters about law and scripture and tradition that ultimately culminates in this historical disaster of the burning of the Talmud. Thank you all for your attention. Thank you for listening to my monologue. I hope that we'll all have a chance to collaboratively discuss, not dispute, some historical material together at some point in the future. Be well, everyone.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for these very stimulating thoughts, and thank you to everyone who joined us from near and from far. And I look forward to opportunities to collaborate, learn together, and from one another in person or online in the coming months. So, wishing you all good health, and I guess those of you in Teaneck, your fast is almost over, so it's a little bit to go. And those of you here in Lakeview, we still have some extra slots for outdoor mincha beginning relatively soon. You can sign up online. Wishing you all an easy fast and a meaningful day, and good health to everyone. Take care.